Imagine a quiet, picturesque town where everyone knows each other's name, where Friday night football is the biggest event of the week, and life moves at a slow, predictable pace. It's the kind of place where front doors are left unlocked, where families have lived for generations, and where secrets, no matter how dark, always find a way to the surface. Carlisle, Ohio. Population just over 5,000. A town so small you might drive right through it without even realizing. But in the summer of 2017, this seemingly peaceful town became the center of a shocking crime that left the nation stunned. A case so disturbing, so deeply unsettling, that it forced people to question everything they thought they knew about small-town innocence. And at the heart of it all was an 18-year-old high school cheerleader named Skylar Richardson. To those who knew her, Skylar was the picture of perfection. Blonde, petite, with an ever-present smile, she was the all-American girl next door. She was popular but not overly outgoing, friendly but kept mostly to herself. She came from a well-respected family, her father, a successful accountant, and her mother, a woman devoted to keeping up appearances. The Richardsons were the kind of family people admired, the kind of family that seemed to have it all together. But behind the carefully curated image of a happy, wholesome life, Skylar was hiding a secret. A secret that, once exposed, would unravel everything. It all started with a routine visit to the doctor, a visit that should have been uneventful, just another checkup before heading off to college in the fall. But that day, everything changed. Because Skylar wasn't just a typical high school senior excited about the next chapter of her life. She was hiding something no one, not even her closest friends or family, had any idea about. She was 8 months pregnant. No one knew. Not her parents. Not her boyfriend. Not even her best friends. Skylar had managed to conceal an entire pregnancy, her petite frame barely showing any signs, her world continuing as if nothing was different. And then, just days later, in the dead of night, Skylar's secret came crashing down in the most horrifying way imaginable. What happened next would spark a criminal investigation, a high-profile trial, and a debate that divided the nation. Was Skylar Richardson a cold-blooded killer who murdered her newborn child in secret? Or was she a scared teenage girl who made a tragic mistake? This is the story of Skylar Richardson, the buried baby case, and the truth that shook Carlisle, Ohio, to its core. For most teenage girls, senior year is supposed to be one of the most exciting times of their lives. Prom, graduation, late nights with friends, and the anticipation of stepping into adulthood. But for Skylar Richardson, senior year was different. It was a year of anxiety, of secrets, of carrying a hidden weight that grew heavier with each passing day. From the outside, nothing seemed unusual. Skylar was a high school cheerleader, performing high jumps and stunts at football games, wearing the same tight uniforms she had worn for years. She went to school, attended family dinners, took selfies with friends, and maintained the image of a normal teenage girl. But beneath the surface, her body was changing in ways she couldn't fully control. Skylar had always struggled with body image. From a young age, she was obsessed with staying thin, terrified of gaining weight. Those closest to her knew she was constantly dieting, counting calories, skipping meals. Her mother, Kim Richardson, also put a heavy emphasis on appearance, always encouraging Skylar to look her best, to stay fit, to maintain that perfect image. It was an unspoken pressure, one that had shaped Skylar's mindset for years. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more true crime stories. So when she started noticing changes in her body, she told herself it was nothing. She couldn't be pregnant. That was impossible. She had only been with a boy once, her ex-boyfriend, the summer before her senior year. One time. It didn't even seem real to her. And besides, she had barely gained any weight. She was still fitting into her clothes. There were no obvious signs, no big belly, no morning sickness. Maybe it was just bloating. Maybe it would go away. But it didn't. Deep down, Skylar knew something was wrong. She ignored it, pushed it to the back of her mind, continued starving herself in hopes that whatever was happening would just disappear. And for a while, it worked. No one noticed. Not her parents. Not her best friends. Not even the boys she was dating at the time. She went to school, went to prom, and lived her life as if nothing was different. Then came the doctor's appointment. It was April 26, 2017. Skylar was just weeks away from graduating high school, preparing for the next phase of her life. That day, her mother took her to a routine checkup with their family OB/GYN. The appointment was meant to be simple, birth control prescription, a quick exam, nothing unusual. But the moment the doctor examined her, everything changed. Skylar was nearly full term. 8 months pregnant. The doctor's words hit her like a tidal wave. 8 months. Not just a few weeks. Not a false alarm. She was carrying a baby. A baby that could be born at any moment. Skylar sat in stunned silence as the doctor asked her if she had felt any movement, if she had noticed the kicks. She hadn't, or at least, she had convinced herself she hadn't. Maybe deep down, she had known. Maybe she had just refused to believe it. The doctor told her she didn't have much time. The baby would be coming soon. Very soon. Skylar nodded, her face pale, her mind spinning. The doctor offered her resources, support, options. But Skylar was barely hearing anything at that point. She left the office that day with a secret bigger than she had ever imagined, a secret that would soon spiral into something she could never take back. And just 10 days later, that secret would be buried in her backyard. The night of May 7, 2017, was supposed to be like any other. Skylar Richardson was at home in Carlisle, Ohio, a quiet town where everyone knew each other, where secrets were supposed to be impossible to keep. But on this night, Skylar carried a secret so immense, so terrifying, that it would alter the course of her life forever. It was late, sometime past midnight, when the pain started. At first, it was just a dull ache in her stomach, something she had felt before. Maybe cramps, maybe just discomfort from not eating enough that day. But soon, the pain sharpened, twisting inside her like a knife. A pressure she had never felt before. It built and built until she could barely breathe. She staggered to the bathroom, clutching the sink, staring at her own reflection in the mirror. She was sweating, shaking. She knew what was happening, but she didn't want to believe it. This couldn't be happening. Not now. Not here. The house was silent. Her parents were asleep just down the hall. If they heard anything, if they found out, everything would be over. She had no one to turn to. No hospital. No doctor. No one holding her hand. Just her. The next few hours were a blur of pain and silence. No screaming, no crying for help. Just muffled gasps, biting down on her own wrist to keep herself quiet. She could feel it happening. Her body giving into something it had been trying to ignore for months. And then, relief. She looked down. A tiny, lifeless body. A baby girl. For a long moment, she just sat there, staring. She didn't know how much time had passed before she finally moved, before she finally reached out and touched the baby's skin. It was pale. Motionless. There was no sound, no movement. No crying. No breathing. It was over. In Skylar's mind, there was no doubt. The baby had been stillborn. She hadn't killed her. She hadn't done anything wrong. This was just what had happened. But what was she supposed to do now? She couldn't tell her parents. That was never an option. She had kept this secret for 8 months, there was no way she could confess now. She had to fix this. She had to make it go away. She cleaned up everything as best as she could. Quietly. Methodically. She wrapped the baby's tiny body in a towel, holding it close to her chest for just a moment. Then, she slipped out the back door. The backyard was pitch black, the only sound was the occasional rustling of leaves. The air was cool, but Skylar was burning up, her body still aching from what had just happened. She grabbed a small shovel from the garage. And then, she dug. The hole wasn't deep. Just enough. Just enough to keep the secret buried. She placed the tiny body inside, covering it carefully with dirt, patting it down to make sure no one would ever see. No prayers. No goodbyes. Just silence. When it was done, she stood there for a moment, staring at the ground, her arms wrapped around herself. And then, she went back inside. She washed her hands. She cleaned herself up. She climbed into bed and stared at the ceiling, waiting for morning to come. As if nothing had ever happened. It started with a phone call. On July 14, 2017, 2 months after that night, Skylar Richardson was sitting in her bedroom when her mother called her downstairs. A police officer was on the phone, asking Skylar to come in for some routine questions. She didn't panic, at least not right away. Why would she? No one knew what had happened. She had gone to prom just days after that night, smiling in photos, acting as if everything was fine. She had gone on with life as usual, pretending nothing had changed. Because, in her mind, nothing had. But what Skylar didn't know was that her secret was already beginning to unravel. 2 days earlier, she had gone to her gynecologist for birth control. It was supposed to be a simple visit. But the doctor, who had delivered her initial pregnancy news months ago, had just one question: what happened to the baby? Skylar froze. She hadn't prepared for this. She stumbled through an answer, trying to keep it vague, trying to move on. But the doctor wasn't satisfied. Something felt off. And when Skylar left that office, the doctor made a call to the authorities. Now, sitting in the police station, Skylar faced her first real test. 2 detectives, Sergeant Carter and Detective Brandy, sat across from her in a small, windowless room. At first, their questions were casual, almost friendly. "How's your summer been? Are you still dating Brandon?" Then, gradually, they got to the real point. "Skylar, we know you were pregnant. Can you tell us what happened?" Skylar's heart pounded. But she kept her voice steady. The baby was stillborn. She gave them a simple story. She had given birth alone. The baby hadn't moved. She panicked and buried her in the backyard. She had been scared, but she hadn't hurt her. The detectives nodded, taking notes. Their expressions didn't change, but the room felt different now. "You're not in trouble," Sergeant Carter reassured her. "We just need to understand everything. Can you show us where you buried her?" And just like that, her secret was no longer hers. A few hours later, police officers were in her backyard, digging. The summer heat pressed down as shovels hit the dirt. Neighbors peeked from their windows, whispering. Skylar sat inside, numb, while her parents tried to process what was happening. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more true crime stories. Then, the officers stopped digging. They had found her. A tiny skeleton, wrapped in remnants of cloth. From that moment on, everything changed. The next time Skylar sat in the interrogation room, the tone was different. The detectives weren't casual anymore. They weren't friendly. They had questions. Harder ones. And now, they had forensic experts telling them something that made the case even more complicated. They believed the baby had been born alive. Skylar's simple story of a stillbirth was no longer enough. The pressure mounted. The interrogations intensified. Hours passed. The questions came again and again. Are you sure she wasn't breathing? Did she cry? Skylar, if something happened, now is the time to tell us. She wanted to stick to her story. She tried. But then, she broke. She hesitated for a second. A second too long. Detectives pressed harder. I may have seen her arms move a little, Skylar whispered. The words hung in the air. It was enough. Enough for the detectives to think she was lying. Enough to charge her with something far worse than burying a stillborn. Now, Skylar wasn't just a scared teenager who made a bad decision. Now, she was a suspect in the death of her own child. The trial of Brooke Skylar Richardson was unlike anything the small town of Carlisle, Ohio, had ever seen. By the time jury selection began in September 2019, 2 years after her secret had been unearthed, the case had become a national spectacle. News cameras lined the courthouse steps. Reporters dissected every detail, her text messages, her weight, her family dynamics. Online forums debated whether she was a scared, naive girl or a cold-blooded killer. Inside the courtroom, Skylar sat motionless at the defense table, her hair pulled back, her face pale. She barely looked up as the prosecution laid out their version of the story, a dark, calculated narrative meant to turn her from a high school cheerleader into a murderer. The prosecution wasted no time painting Skylar as a self-obsessed teenager who cared more about her image than her own child's life. They had one goal, to prove that Annabelle, Skylar's baby, had been born alive and that Skylar had killed her. Their star witness was Dr. Susan Brown, the forensic anthropologist who had examined Annabelle's remains. Dr. Brown had concluded that the baby's bones showed signs of charring, suggesting that Skylar had not only buried her daughter but had also attempted to burn the remains. The courtroom fell silent as the prosecution projected an image of the tiny, fragile bones on the screen. This is not the case of a stillbirth, the prosecutor said, pacing the courtroom. This is a case of a mother who killed her child because she saw her as an inconvenience. The jury sat stiffly, absorbing every word. Then came the text messages. The prosecution displayed messages Skylar had sent just hours after giving birth. I'm literally speechless with how happy I am. I have my belly back. The messages were damning. They painted a picture of a girl who wasn't grieving but celebrating the fact that her body was back, that she was free. To the prosecution, it was clear, Skylar had always planned to get rid of her baby. But the defense wasn't about to let that narrative go unchallenged. Skylar's attorney, Charles M. Rickers, knew that if he was going to save her from a life behind bars, he had to dismantle the state's theory piece by piece. His first target, Dr. Brown's claim about charring. The defense called in their own forensic experts, specialists who directly contradicted Dr. Brown's findings. There was no evidence of burning, one expert testified firmly. None at all. The prosecution's strongest claim had just crumbled. Then, Rickers turned his attention to the so-called confession, the moment in Skylar's interrogation when she had hesitated and admitted she maybe saw her baby's arms move. He played the footage of the interrogation for the jury. The video showed Skylar, a frail 18-year-old, sitting in a police station, shifting uncomfortably as two detectives pressed her over and over. She was vulnerable, Rickers argued. She was scared. She was confused. And they made her doubt herself. By the time the defense rested, the case had taken a sharp turn. The once clear narrative that Skylar had killed her baby was no longer so clear. The charring evidence had been disproven. The confession seemed unreliable. And no one, not a single expert, could say with certainty whether Annabelle had been born alive. Now, it was up to the jury. As they deliberated, the public remained divided. To some, Skylar was a monster. A privileged, image-obsessed girl who had chosen her own future over her child's life. To others, she was a tragic figure. A young girl with an eating disorder, under immense pressure, who had made a terrible mistake but had not committed murder. After 4 days of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Everyone held their breath. Skylar, flanked by her attorneys, trembled. Then, the judge read the decision, not guilty of murder. Not guilty of involuntary manslaughter. Not guilty of child endangerment. The courtroom erupted. Some gasped in shock. Others whispered angrily. But Skylar? She broke down, sobbing. She wasn't completely free. She was found guilty of abuse of a corpse for burying her daughter, but she wouldn't spend the rest of her life in prison. A few days later, she stood before the judge for sentencing. Her voice was barely above a whisper as she apologized. "I just want to say how sorry I am," she said. "I would do anything to go back and change what happened." The judge sentenced her to 3 years of probation. And just like that, the trial was over. But outside that courtroom, the debate never ended. Had justice been served? Or had a guilty person walked free? Even today, years later, the question remains. When the verdict was read, the courtroom was a mix of shock, relief, and outrage. Skylar Richardson, the young woman who had been accused of killing her newborn and burying her in the backyard, was found not guilty of murder, manslaughter, and child endangerment. The only charge that stuck was abuse of a corpse, and for that, she received 3 years of probation. For some, it was a miscarriage of justice. For others, it was a rightful conclusion to a case that had been built on shaky evidence. As soon as the trial ended, Skylar's life changed forever. Even though she had avoided prison, she hadn't escaped the weight of public judgment. Outside the courthouse, a storm of reporters waited. The news spread like wildfire. Social media exploded with reactions. Some saw Skylar as a manipulative liar who had escaped punishment simply because she was young, white, and privileged. Others believed she was a broken, traumatized girl who had suffered enough. But the most vocal were those who believed the justice system had failed Annabelle. The baby girl whose life was cut short before it even began. People demanded answers. Where was Annabelle's justice? In Carlisle, Ohio, the town where Skylar had grown up, the fallout was immediate. Some of her former classmates and neighbors couldn't look at her the same way. Local mothers whispered in grocery store aisles, shaking their heads. "I don't care what the jury said," one woman told a reporter. "She had a baby, and that baby is gone. Something isn't right." For months, her family lived under a cloud of scrutiny. People drove by their house just to gawk at the backyard where Annabelle had been buried. Others sent hate mail, filled with cruel words and threats. But not everyone turned against her. Her parents, Kim and Scott Richardson, stood by her side, determined to help her rebuild her life. And Skylar? She tried to move on. She enrolled in college, hoping to live a quiet life away from the public eye. But it wasn't that easy. The case had followed her. Her name had been splashed across headlines for 2 years. Her face had been on every news broadcast. She had become a symbol of a deeply divided debate about justice, privilege, and morality. There were rumors that she had trouble finding work because of her past. That she struggled with anxiety and depression, haunted by everything that had happened. And then, there was Annabelle. For all the focus on Skylar, on her struggles, her future, her pain, there was still the question of the baby girl who had been buried in the backyard. People still wondered. In one interview, her lawyer insisted that Skylar would carry the pain of that night for the rest of her life. But the public wasn't so sure. For years after the trial, the debate continued. Some believed Skylar was a victim of a broken system, a girl with severe body image issues who was too scared to ask for help. Others saw her as someone who had gotten away with murder. But one thing was certain, the case of Brooke Skylar Richardson had changed lives. It had divided a town. It had sparked debates on teen pregnancy, mental health, and the criminal justice system. And no matter where people stood on the verdict, one truth remained. A baby was gone. And the world would never know for sure what really happened on the night she was born. That if you found this case as gripping as we did, don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more true crime stories, and comment below with your thoughts. Was justice served? Let's discuss.